how far down in nature does consciousness run? I am completely convinced that this is a totally legitimate and very important scientific question at this point in time. Your brain is working with an operation that 99% of the time is giving you accurate information, but you can trick it and kind of expose the way it's not necessarily giving you a perfect window onto reality. There's a construction taking place. They did psilocybin and LSD research. Something like 80% of the scientists in the study of 200 and something scientists came out of that experience with an answer to the problem they had been stuck on. Things that are very common for people to experience is a dropping away of self. And from a neuroscience perspective, the experience we have of being a self in the way we experience it is really an illusion. In those states, we do in certain situations get a much more accurate window onto reality. It may be that the thing we experience is a mapping of something else, and that something else is actually very different from space and time.
Has it been fun to do all these interviews and like dive into what you've been learning about consciousness? I'm curious if by doing the interviews and talking it through that anything's even evolved from that.
I have a hard time with interviews. I trust myself much more as a writer. I like to take my time to craft my words and really make sure I get everything right. So it's interesting. It's been a challenge for me since my book came out in 2019. But this book tour has actually, I feel like I'm learning something that I didn't learn the first time around. And I think the more comfortable I am, the more these end up being, I mean, they're like the conversations that I recorded for the docuseries, where it's wonderful to have people listen to this 11-hour creation that I thought, maybe 5 people in the world would be interested in. And everyone has different questions and makes me think about it differently. And I mean, I don't know how much of the series you had time to listen to, but I'm sure you got the idea that I'm just fascinated by this topic and I can't stop thinking about it. And so it's giving me, different from the research that I did and interviewing scientists, it's giving me new things to think about.
To be honest, I had no plan for that question. It was something that actually just kind of came through me, which is right on par for the kind of conversation I'm having. And just so you know, consciousness fascinates me. The things that you're studying fascinate me.
Yeah.
So it makes me curious to think, where do the questions come from then?
Yeah.
If it feels like, because you hear people speak to music or information or a speech or something, or like something that has a lot of energy behind it, and then they'll describe it as like it flows through me.
Yeah.
So like that wasn't even a question. I was just like, that one was just like, it like was like, no, that's kind of flowing through me. So I'm curious how that plays into what you've learned and about where consciousness comes from, and if it's fundamental or if it arises, like what comes up when I mention that.
Don't let me forget to answer your question, but this is related to something I was just thinking about, which also just came through me because I was reading about your career, and it's so fascinating to me, and it's so different from anything I've ever done, except that when you came on, I realized, so I was a professional dancer for many years, from 18 to about 23, until an illness forced me to quit. But I was just thinking, as you were asking that question, that there's something about that performance and that intense concentration that must be very similar to your experience of racing, where, it's not a life or death thing on stage, although there were a couple of things not like anything you experienced, but there were a couple of times where the choreography was, such that it was
slightly dangerous,
on the dangerous side. Yeah. But of course, the pressure of the performance going well and all your fellow dancers relying on you to do your part, and that high pressure, high anxiety, high focus, being in the moment is something that I think we probably share kind of in our training. And it's one of the things that brought me to become interested in meditation, which I think is something I was essentially already doing as a dancer, hyper focused on the present moment. And so my belief at this point, I'm open to other interpretations, but thinking about this question a lot about when you have the experience of not having created something, but feeling like you're just kind of a vehicle for it to come through.
Yeah.
My sense is that is just a more accurate view on reality, and that basically everything is that way. And when we have this sense that there's this I behind The thought that that's actually an illusion and that we're more in touch with reality when we're in that flow state or when we're kind of more open. The truth is that's what it all is it's all an unfolding. I mean, in the big picture, it's all an unfolding of the universe, and we are a
Mm.
piece of the universe, and we're, work in progress. We are, our brains are not static things. That's endless dance of electrical firing that is happening in every moment. And so there's a sense in which, yes, things are unfolding, including our own thoughts, our own brain processes.
So that makes me think about if that's the way it is, if it's, well, it's getting to the question of, is it arising from that complex? Is it arising from the brain? Is that where consciousness comes from? Or is it fundamental? And so, well, first off, what conclusion or belief, or where have you landed after all of your studying? And
one thing that I love about this topic is that we really don't know. And I certainly don't know. And so it's one of, these great mysteries that we are still faced with. There's something beautiful about a true mystery where no human being at this point in time has the answer. So I keep leaning more and more in one direction, but I don't know. But this is the question that has fascinated me for decades at this point. The main question is, how far down in nature does consciousness run? So I've become convinced that it's extremely unlikely that it arises out of brain processing,
right.
And probably goes deeper in nature than that. How deep, I don't know. But as you know, I asked this question for over the course of 3 to 4 years for this documentary series. And I myself actually became totally surprised by where my beliefs were moving. So I should say actually that I spent decades working with neuroscientists. I'm very much embedded in the sciences, even though I'm not a scientist, a trained scientist myself. I've worked with many scientists, physicists, and neuroscientists. Until I would say about 15 or so years ago, I just assumed, like most scientists, that the brain generates consciousness, and we don't yet know how, but one day we'll understand that. And the longer I worked with neuroscientists and the more I understood about the brain, the less that seemed likely to me, and the more I thought it was a kind of a more basic function of biology, perhaps, but maybe even deeper. So through the course of working on this documentary series, and I say this carefully because it still sounds crazy to me coming out of my mouth.
Being a
But
scientist, I'm sure.
I think it's more likely than not that consciousness is actually at the more fundamental level, and maybe at the most fundamental level.
Yeah.
And that we've been confused by a lot of things about our circumstance being, the human brain is the most complex system in the universe that we know of. And so being human brains and being conscious has kind of driven us to have these false assumptions that consciousness is related to that complexity, is related to all of the complex behaviors and things that brains are capable of.
Just like lopping it in there on things that we don't understand. We don't
Well, and it's so
the brain,
intuitive.
so we don't understand consciousness. They must be connected.
Well, yes, and also, anywhere we look for evidence, we can only find communication and report from other systems that are similar to us. So the less similar a system is, the less likely we are going to see behavior that we normally associate with, other conscious beings. And I think that has really misled us in the sciences. And so I'll say that at the very least, wherever I land on the spectrum, I kind of put it at like 65%, 70%. I think consciousness is fundamental at this point. In either case, I am completely convinced that this is a totally legitimate and very important scientific question at this point in time. How far down in nature does it run?
I appreciate you giving a percentage and not saying like yes or no, because in my experience with, those who are more scientific, that unless there's like a clear conclusion, which may lead to why it's like sometimes uncomfortable to have conversations without being able to slow down and be analytical, is that, a lot of times someone doesn't want to give an answer because they're like, I don't know. That's the answer. It's like, I appreciate that because that's helpful in the progress of the situation. So what was it that you what was it that you discovered in your journey that made you feel that shifted your perspective so much?
So originally, I would say when I finished my book called Conscious came out in 2019. And at that point, I kind of landed at what felt like 50-50. by the end of the researching and writing of that book. And then two things happened in the meantime. One, I just became, every year I'm more educated in neuroscience and how the brain works. And I've become more and more convinced of the reasons why we have made some false assumptions. And I can kind of go through that argumentation if you're interested.
Yep.
But I'll just plant that flag there. So I've become more convinced that we've made some false assumptions that have led us to believe that consciousness arises out of complex processing, namely in brains. And so on one side, it's less that I'm more confident that it's fundamental, but I'm much more confident that we're wrong in our assumptions about how consciousness does arise in the universe. And the other thing that happened during the course of working on this documentary film is I mostly spoke with physicists, because as this question became more and more legitimate in my mind, it was taken out of the realm of neuroscience and into the realm of physics, because if we're talking about fundamental forces and fundamental features. And so I went into my conversations with physicists very open and really wanting to know, essentially, do any of these physicists who I respect and who are very well respected, who are doing very important work in fundamental physics, do any of them, can they give me reasons, or are they convinced that placing consciousness at a more fundamental level doesn't make sense at all and it's easy to rule out for some reason? And then on the other side of that, is it possible that treating consciousness as fundamental helps in any way in any of these new theories of quantum gravity and, the kind of at the forefront of fundamental physics? Is there any way in which it actually helps us understand what we see at the quantum level if we place consciousness at a fundamental level? And what I found through the years of conversations with these scientists is that at least I became convinced not only is it not easy to rule out, but that in some cases it actually does make it easier to understand the science. And so that's how I went from 50-50 in 2019 with the publication of my book to more like 65-70% convinced. At this point, I'm just convinced that it is absolutely a legitimate scientific path. I think even if consciousness isn't fundamental, your starting assumption kind of dictates how you do the science. And our starting assumption has been that consciousness arises out of complexity at the level of the brain. And we've done some fascinating science, and all the neuroscience that's been done with that assumption has brought us, nothing but a deeper understanding of the brain and incredible technologies. And so even if that's not right, because when we don't know, we have to start with an assumption.
Sure.
And so I'm very interested now in having kind of the next generation of scientists, or scientists who are interested in this, and there are many already interested in this, in saying, okay, well, maybe we're wrong. Maybe consciousness is fundamental. If we start with the assumption that consciousness is fundamental, not knowing, how do we think about science differently, and what kinds of questions come up? And if we look at phenomena we don't yet totally understand, if we put it in the framework of, let's assume consciousness is fundamental, can we approach this in a different way or a new creative way? And so I'm very excited about that future of science, whether or not it turns out it is fundamental.
I think that's a really great way of saying that. You have to start with an assumption, right? Or else, where do you start? You have to start with an idea or assumption. So with the assumption that consciousness is fundamental, what does start to prove out? What makes more sense?
I almost feel like we should backtrack, because that's basically chapter 10 of my 10-chapter documentary. And I'm happy to just jump in there. I don't need to go in any order, but I'm aware that I kind of flagged.
Let's take people on the journey then.
Yeah.
So if it starts the other way, or much earlier in the process, where would you plant that flag?
Our understanding of how the brain works. There are some very intuitive things that turn out to be false intuitions or illusions. And those come up in how we think about consciousness and how it seems to be operating for us. We've learned enough about the brain to know that in some of those situations, those assumptions and those intuitions are wrong.
You're bumming me out, because I thought all intuitions were right. I would thought all intuition is like, when has your intuition ever been wrong?
Right.
Never. So, okay, but this is good. I love learning.
No, this is, so I talk a lot. I have a whole section on intuitions in my documentary, because in some ways, intuitions are all we have, the understanding that gravity is part of space-time, one of the most famous and important intuitions any scientist ever had, Albert Einstein, that originally came in the form of an intuition. And intuitions are everything.
I mean,
however, they can be wrong. And so the way I define an intuition is just a very strong feeling that something is true, but
yeah,
you don't know the reasons behind it.
right.
And so,
Like the timelines are out of order. It's like
yes.
we're in space where the space time doesn't exist and all dimensions and timelines are collapsing.
You'll have to tell me more about that.
I don't think I could educate you on
Is this
anything.
I listened to a recent interview of yours where you spoke about your a psychedelic experience that you had that I found very interesting and wonderful and beautifully expressed. So I wonder if that's what you just said is related to any of that, but we can come back. We can circle back to that.
I definitely want to circle back to psychedelics a little bit, but keep going on. Keep going on.
So, a simple example of a processing in the brain that we understand pretty well now is something called binding. There are many different types of binding processes. And I cite David Eagleman's work a lot. David Eagleman is a neuroscientist and has written some wonderful, accessible books on the subject. Fascinating. And so binding processes happen in the brain because all of the signals that are traveling through space and that enter our brain, the light waves, the sound waves, the sense of touch, all the ways we perceive the outside world, these signals travel at different speeds. They reach different parts of the brain at different times, and they take different amounts of time to be processed by the brain. So in my book, I give the example of playing tennis. Playing piano is another one. I give an example of where in our conscious experience in tennis, my experience is of feeling the pressure of the ball hitting the racket in the same moment that I hear the sound, in the same moment that I see the ball hit the racket, right? So my brain has actually woven all of these signals together for me and delivered this present moment experience, which is about 500 milliseconds after the event, because it takes a certain amount of time, some number of milliseconds, for the sound waves are traveling slower than the light waves. They reach my body at a different time.
Sure.
My fingers are much further from my brain than the light waves coming in and getting processed. But they also take different amounts of time to be processed by the brain. So there are these binding processes, and they're incredibly interesting, where all of this happens within about 500 milliseconds before we have the experience of, bam, I hit the ball. Almost everything we experience, David Eagleman, because our brain has to decide what happened when and what is the correct, which is going to be the most useful way. These are all kind of carved by evolution. How will we succeed best? And it is, this long, fascinating process of evolution of the most complex things we know of in the universe, our brains, who can do this and help us navigate the world by giving us this present moment experience. One of the ways neuroscientists learned about these processes is by breaking them, essentially. So you can use illusions to trick your brain and see how you can kind of mess with the binding. There are also brain disorders where we've learned a lot from people who have something that's gone wrong with binding processes, and they actually are not able to sync sound and sight, which is, obviously
that would
very different, difficult way to navigate the
reality.
world. There are some studies that have been done where our kind of the clocks of how binding happens are based on our constant interaction with the world. So that actually is constantly being fine-tuned. And it's based on our behavior. The brain is constantly paying attention to what we're touching, what we're seeing, what we're feeling, and kind of acclimating all the time to a new situation. So a very simple study that was done was giving participants a button that they could push. And when they push the button, a light flashes. They had it arranged. So initially you push the button, and the minute you push the button, the light flashes, practically instantaneous. And so your brain figures that out very quickly, and you push the button and you see the light flash. Now, if you start to insert a delay in how long it takes for the light to flash, if you do it slowly enough, your brain makes the adjustment. So you can insert a 10 millisecond delay, and then a 20, and then a 30. And you can get to the point where the light is no longer flashing when you hit the button. There's a delay, but you are not aware of it. You still have the experience of pushing the button and having the light flash. Now, if you take that delay out and you don't do it gradually, so the brain doesn't have time to adjust, you remove the delay. So you've gotten up to, let's say, 200 millisecond delay. You push the button. It feels like the light flashes as soon as you do that, but there's actually a 200 millisecond delay you don't notice. You remove the delay. and you push the button, and your experience is that the light flashes before you hit the button. Right. Because your brain didn't have time to make the adjustment. And so it's delivering the wrong sequence of events to your conscious experience.
Wow.
And this is such a simple, there are many, many, if anyone's interested, I have lots of, there are pages of notes on all the chapters in my documentary series. So you can look up some of these books and studies
fascinating.
But just with this simple study, you start to crack the surface of ways in which sometimes our intuitions are incorrect. And sometimes the way we experience things because of a glitch or just because it works most of the time. There are all these fascinating visual illusions. I'm sure you and your audience have seen, two different lines look like they're different lengths and you actually put them together, you lay them on top of each other and they're the same, but you can't actually correct it. You can know that they are the same length, but somehow when they're under a certain lighting or from a certain perspective, one just looks like it's almost twice as long as the other, right? And you can't correct that in your vision because your brain is working with an operation that 99% of the time is giving you accurate information. But you can trick it and kind of expose the way it's not necessarily giving you a perfect window onto reality. There's a construction taking place.
These are more illusions. These are more just like illusionary situations within life that the brain, we don't quite understand, or you do understand how it can trick us, but now we're away from intuition. So this has nothing to do with intuition, right? Because this is just illusions.
Yes and no. So an intuition is really just a feeling that something is true. And so, there's been a lot of work in violent, dangerous situations, excuse me. Gavin de Becker wrote a wonderful book called The Gift of Fear. And it's essentially the message is to trust your intuitions, but he explains why you have the intuitions you have, which is so interesting because most of it is unconscious processing. Yeah, no, I think you would love this book. Yeah. It's so informative. And I think especially for women, it's incredibly useful because we have very good intuitions for knowing when we're in a dangerous situation.
Exactly. I mean, it was definitely something I wanted to mention was how like women differ from men in this way. And why is that? And
so a lot of women, especially, but a lot of people, when they've been attacked or a victim of a violent crime, they will later say, I had a strong feeling I shouldn't have gotten in the elevator or whatever the situation was. But I couldn't point to anything, I couldn't see anything that was wrong and I didn't want to be rude. And I felt like maybe I was just being anxious. But what he talks about is why that feeling exists. And so there can be countless things that your brain is processing subconsciously in the same way that it processes, everything I spoke about with a tennis racket or playing piano, those types of things. When someone's pupils are dilated, when their skin is flushed, there are many physical cues like this. When someone is adrenalized and about to act violently, we can pick up on these things without being aware, without thinking, oh, his pupils are dilated, or I know, it's all things that get processed subconsciously.
So we're saying these are sort of energies or frequencies, not micro expressions. Because if they were like face, eyes, like maybe we're just really good at
no, I think I actually don't know about micro expressions, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the story. Right. But lots of details too, like you can register that where you left your keys, like they've been shifted slightly, or the door wasn't left exactly the way you locked it, or all these things. Obviously, we can consciously notice them, but most of the time, our brains are processing so much information that most of it doesn't enter conscious awareness. And in a situation like that, you will just get this overwhelming feeling something's wrong. I'm scared. And there's a good reason for it. You've actually noticed 50 signals. Just, you didn't notice them consciously. And so that's what intuitions are for. And, they're incredibly useful and have evolved for a reason. But we can get a strong feeling about something also and be wrong. And so this is what I find,
Does
so
that happen
fascinating.
To you? Do you feel like have you had strong intuitions and them not be correct?
Well, one was about consciousness. But yes, I'm 48 now, and I think living my life as a woman until this age, and being interested in the things that I'm interested in, I think I've gotten very good at knowing when an intuition is based on something that's real that's going on or based on anxiety or something else.
The difference between intuition being a real something streaming from the field, something connecting to the field, or whether or not it's a fear-born idea or an anxious idea. I mean, I
Sure.
ask that question all the time
Yeah.
about like what's the difference between, because intuitions aren't always positive. Sometimes they're negative.
Yeah.
And so you
Yeah.
think like, oh,
No,
I'm
they're
just
often
scared right now.
negative.
I'm freaking out. So,
Exactly.
that in and of itself is perhaps an indistinguishable difference.
Yeah.
Because again, we're just no science to the anxiety versus intuition, unless maybe they were able to sort of track brain waves or where the brain lights up and understand if it's coming from the amygdala and it's some kind of fear response, or whether or not it's not active and something else is, maybe, right? Has there been studies
and
about that?
this is why I love the neuroscience. Well, this is why I love Gavin de Becker's work, because
That's
it
it.
tells
I
you
feel like I should look that
what
person up.
he explains, what your brain is actually perceiving and why you're getting the feeling. And so knowing those things, you can actually look for them. And that's what's so useful about his book, is you don't have to be in a situation, at least, in the situations he describes, where you have a feeling. You can actually look for the things. Oh, are that person's pupils dilated? Or is their skin flush? Check the door. Check, like when you feel that way, you can check it against actual things in the environment, which I find so, it's so helpful. The more we understand how the brain works, and the more we understand the world, the better suited we are to understand what our intuitions are telling us, which I think is so helpful. Intuitions about consciousness is where, so, a lot, I think some of the most important science is usually based on shaking up intuitions. And so, there's all the useful intuitions we just spoke about, but I kind of go through a list of some of the most important scientific breakthroughs. And they've come out of, usually we get evidence from whatever it is, from testing or from celestial observations, that the way we feel the world is constructed is actually not right. So understanding that the earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. Our intuitions, our experience kind of tells us the earth is flat and the sun is going, there's there's a good reason that human beings thought that's the way the universe was constructed for a long time,
Sure.
until people started watching and getting clues that maybe that wasn't the right way. And it took a very, very long time for people, once we had the evidence, for humanity to accept this very counterintuitive thing. It felt so wrong. And it takes time to kind of shake up your intuitions and then accept the evidence and what, your new information is telling you. And then it kind of becomes common knowledge. Then we just accept it and we kind of move on to the next thing. Many, many forces that we've discovered through physics. The germ theory of disease was actually another huge one, where that ran so counter to the way people believed we got sick, which is totally understandable, because we can't see bacteria or viruses. We
Was
can't
this the
smell them.
doctor
We can't.
one? Was this the doctor one where he'd go from person to person without, like, just without washing his hand? Was that the story about him
Well,
not
I
washing
think
his
there
hands?
were, I actually don't know the full history, but I think there were multiple moments like this where the doctors and scientists who kind of were believed more and more in this germ theory of disease had to prove this in different ways to people,
Yeah.
because when you can't see or feel or taste or smell, and you've been taught, through generation to generation, that it's whatever it is, a god or something you did to anger the gods, or whatever the story happened to be, to believe that there are these invisible things.
Yeah. Well, I think this doctor, I think if I could be very wrong, but
Yeah.
I think it was that he was, the people were getting sick. He wasn't washing his hands. So
Oh,
he began to
yes.
wash his hands because he was trying to get the energy off from the person
Uh,
before. But it ended up
this
just being the
this sounds
germs,
familiar.
just like
Yes.
getting the
Yes.
energy off. So it was like an
Yeah.
intuition of like something needed to get off, right?
Yes.
And he just like imagined that it was energetics of some
Yeah.
sort, something more spiritual.
Sure.
Turned out to be quite biological
Bacteria.
and
Yeah.
exactly.
But so, yeah, so anytime we have like a big shift like this in science, or of our understanding of kind of the deeper reality, usually it requires that we shake up some intuition that we have, a way we feel the universe must be structured. And it's kind of, time and time again. I'm actually now remembering there's a story about H. pylori, the bacteria that causes all
Mm.
80% of ulcers.
Ah,
And this is, more in modern times. I think at some point in the 1900s, There's a doctor who discovered this bacteria, H. pylori, and realized this was causing ulcers. And it was such a pervasive and um, closely held belief among doctors that stress was the main component of ulcers that no one believed him. And he ended up, I think there's a scientific paper on this, he ended up ingesting H. pylori himself, giving himself an ulcer, and then curing himself with antibiotics to prove that bacteria was a huge part of the problem.
Well, I think
In
H.
most
pylori
cases.
is in like almost 80% of people. So
It
I think
is.
it's
No,
like
it's
the
an
most
overgrowth.
common thing.
It
so
is. It's
the
an
fact that
overgrowth that leads to ulcers. Yes.
so stress being
Like most
something
things.
everyone has could be somewhat
And
of
of
a
course, stress is always a
interesting thought.
factor, and we understand that now too. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so intuition shattering and shaking and playing around with is something that is kind of central to the sciences, and is something that I've always found really interesting and fascinating. One thing I begin the documentary with is something that I still do occasionally. I used to do this as a kid. When I learned about gravity, I was so I mean, each child kind of has to go through their own
Yeah.
learning of how humanity has understood our situation in the universe. And I remember it didn't feel that way to me. I still felt like there was up and there was down. I didn't feel like I was on a planet, and so I wanted to get a visceral sense of it. And so I'd lie down on the ground, just in starfish position, and try to feel that gravity was holding me against this sphere, and I was looking out at the universe, that I'm kind of like flying through the universe rather than on this flat surface with an up and a down.
That isn't moving. So you
And
imagined yourself also flying through space, like on the
right.
top, right?
Yeah, like we're
Yeah.
on a ride.
Yeah.
Like it turns out we're on a ride, but it doesn't feel that way. And I wanted to kind of feel it more. And I love that feeling where, like, just for a moment, like you get your imagination, you get focused enough, you kind of feel it, you change the way you feel about gravity, and you suddenly feel like, yes, that's all out there. And
Yeah.
I'm like stuck to the side of the planet.
Yeah.
And
Well,
there's something beautiful about changing your intuition so that you can kind of feel the deeper truth of the situation that you're in.
that makes me think of just like a form of manifesting, where you think of what you want and
Mm,
then you imagine the
mm,
feeling, having
mm,
have it or accomplished it. And so basically you're putting yourself in
mm,
the future timeline. You're actually
mm.
putting yourself there, and that essentially by being there now you have no resistance to it, because you're
Oh
also
yeah,
not wanting it, because you
right.
have
It's
it.
all
You've
it's already there.
it's
Yeah,
already there.
yeah. No, that's an interesting connection. Yeah,
How does that correlate with consciousness and
I'm
the
not
way
sure.
that things work? Because it seems
No, I mean,
it
with
seems
human psychology, no, I think it's an incredibly valuable tool I mean, you described it very well. It is. We have many obstacles in the way, kind of we're wired psychologically to get in our own way and even to understand the science, right? And so I think, yes, visualizing, really getting yourself into a state that you maybe have doubts about and setting those aside and actually being there. Yes, I mean,
yeah.
our brains are kind of generating our reality almost as much as reality is being generated for itself. There's a neuroscientist, Anil Seth, who uses a phrase that I hope I get right. It's I think it's your brain hallucinates your reality. And this is
Yeah.
pointing to, not something mystical really, just the fact that the brain is producing the type of experience we're having in every moment. And so, when I look across the room and see there's a pink ribbon over there, we used to think that pink was a property out in the universe, that pink existed outside. And the truth is that there are light waves and they enter our retina and our brain does this processing, and the brain actually generates the experience of pink. The experience of seeing pink is not out there in the
Right.
universe. It is in here.
I've experienced that.
Our brain is doing that everything that we experience. It doesn't mean it's disconnected from reality. It's very
Mhm.
much embedded in and connected to the outside world. But the thing we experience is not necessarily the thing out there. It is our
Right.
brains giving us a picture, a map of the external
Well,
reality.
they even say that bugs don't see color the way we do.
Mm.
Like they
Yeah,
don't know
sure.
what flower to go to. Like it's not like there's the red flower. They see differently. They see a
Well, they
frequency.
see a different spectrum. I mean,
Different
there's a lot
spectrum.
of light that we don't see. It's just passing right
Correct.
through us. It's in the room, and the bees are seeing ultraviolet wavelengths, and we are
Correct.
not. There's a wonderful article by the philosopher Thomas Nagel that I also mention in my series, and there's a note to it in whatever chapter I mention it in. And the title is just "What is it like to be a bat?" And he just does this beautiful exercise of, we use vision to navigate the world and other things, but mostly vision. Bats are using sonar. And what is that like? Like, what
Sure.
experientially, what is that like for them? I mean, they can navigate the world at least as well as we can, but in some cases better because sonar works so well as a tool. But what is it? Does it feel like sound? Does it feel like visual? Like, what is that? What is their universe like?
The one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the waves and the frequencies, or like the
Mm,
experience you have in pink not being real. I mean,
mm,
one of my medicine journeys, I've really only done
mm.
two main ones.
Okay.
This one was psilocybin.
Mm,
And it was that basically I dropped in and it was like, oh wow, being human's not real. Okay, wow,
yeah.
this my sister's gonna be so pissed at me. That's what I
Right.
thought. She's not.
Yeah.
She's This isn't her zone of life.
Right.
She's a mom of four. So, she doesn't get out there in the edges of things. So I
Yeah.
was like, man, my sister's gonna be so mad at me. I'm not gonna be human anymore. But I was like, basically, I'm a
Yeah.
waveform. Like it was all these. It
Yeah.
was
Oh,
basically just sort of like
interesting.
a
Yeah.
wave. And that all the things that we experience, whether it be color or food or feeling, is just sort of these waves intersecting with us.
Mm.
And that creates the experience. And I
Yeah.
usually get cold when I'm in those places. So I'm like in those
Mm.
states. So I'm like, oh man,
Yeah.
I'm cold. And then I was like, damn it, now cold's not real. And it was like, no, no, no,
Mm.
grab a blanket. You're
Yeah.
cold. You're having that
Yeah.
experience. Doesn't
It's
mean
a
you're
f-
not cold. It's
yeah.
just the experience you're having. So follow the
Yeah.
experience. So I wonder what you believe about plant medicine or about some of these
Yeah.
psychedelics and these spaces, and if
Yeah.
you have done them and would be, if you want to share
Yes.
that, or if you
Yeah,
don't.
so
But
and I talk about it in the series. It comes up a lot actually, both
okay.
meditation and psychedelics. And
Sure,
I
sure.
think they're both wonderful tools for shaking up our intuitions, which is, one of the
Right.
main reasons why I love them so much. Yeah, our brains have developed over the course of our lives. And, it's kind of like these grooves that get carved, which are
Right.
incredibly useful for keeping us alive, but not necessarily useful for seeing the truth of reality. Yes, when we're able to break free of our normal way of experiencing the world, I
Hmm.
think it's incredibly useful. Actually, many scientists, there was research back when it was legal to do research in the 50s. There was research done with scientists who were stuck on a problem,
Hmm.
and then I think this study, the one I'm thinking of was LSD,
LSD, yeah.
but they did psilocybin and LSD research, and something like 80% of the scientists in the study of 200 and something scientists came out of that experience with an answer to the problem they had been
Oh
stuck
wow.
on.
They say it
And
increases
so,
neuroplasticity too. So
right, right. And so I think, yes, for creativity, I mean, I see science as a creative endeavor as well. For breaking out of patterns in ways that can be useful for understanding things better, and our own psychology. I mean, people find it to be psychologically. There's all this research now using psychedelic assisted therapy. I think same thing. It breaks you out of a pattern and enables you to see something actually more clearly than you had seen it before. So I'm very, very fascinated by these experiences. I talk about in the series how I never thought there was a scientific application to, like, that was kind of the extent to which I thought those experiences that I had had with psychedelics and in meditation, I thought they were useful psychologically, at the neuroscientific level. But I started to actually wonder, and again, I felt like I was crazy for wondering this, but I started to wonder if maybe some of the things we experience in those states are actually giving us better information about the underlying reality. Things that are very common for people to experience is a dropping away of self. And from a neuroscience perspective, the experience we have of being a self in the way we experience it is really an illusion. That becomes viscerally clear in certain states. And so that's already something that we understand scientifically, but that we didn't know human beings could really experience. But it turns out on psychedelics and meditation and under other circumstances, we can actually drop this illusion of self, in which case we are experiencing the universe in a more truthful way. We've kind of let go of an illusion. Where I got interested was I've had many experiences, I'm sure you have as well, of being in a spaceless, timeless existence. Yes. So no self, no space, no time, which is very strange to even say because our language doesn't even allow us a way to describe what that experience is because it doesn't actually make sense. But this is where fundamental physics is headed. And I became very interested in that. And I do it very skeptically and very carefully. I don't want to ever assume because I've had an experience, that means that's the way the world is. But I find it very interesting that these things that seem to be illusory. Space is one I get into. I think it's chapter 8 is about space and time. There's practically a consensus among physicists now that space is not part of the fundamental story, that space is an emergent property. And the fact that that seems very, very true in certain states of meditation or psychedelics is interesting to me. And I just wonder if evolution has kind of carved the way we experience. And so I know, sorry that I dropped
you just
a big one.
Yeah, you did. I'm like, hang on a second. I'm trying to wrap my head around space is emergent space.
So most physicists do not believe space is part of the fundamental fabric of reality. But let me give you an example that might help you digest this, which took me many, many months to get to. But now it's so helpful. I want to give it to you right away. So in the same way that pink is not something that's an external property that exists in the universe, it's mapping light waves. And, it is my brain's presentation of something that's very useful. But it gives me the impression that pink is out there in the world rather than it being a map for me so that I can navigate the world. So space, the way I've been thinking about it, and, this is still much in the question mark realm. We don't really understand any of this. But the way I've been thinking about it is maybe space is also a mapping of something in the external world, but it's not space the way we experience space. And so this idea of these dimensions and traveling and that type of thing is actually an illusory. It is a great
quantum entanglement.
We have
quantum entanglement is the first thing that comes to mind. Please explain that one.
That's one of the reasons why physicists don't believe space is fundamental anymore, because those types of things, the evidence we're getting in the same way that scientists long ago observed, the heavens and noticed that it didn't really make sense that the sun was circling around us. The results of these experiments in quantum mechanics tell us that our intuitions about space cannot be right. And we don't know exactly what it means, but yeah.
Even on like the much more micro level, I even think about the simple act of administering, let's say, something to put you to sleep, like the drug or some kind of drug. Maybe it's a relaxant, maybe whatever it is. Or I've done intramuscular ketamine, like the experience of whatever you get put into your body, and all of a sudden the whole body agrees like that. Like all of a sudden you just go boom. Like how does the body stay that connected to all that information? Like it's almost like on a micro level, space doesn't exist either. It's all somewhat collapsed within us, that the whole body can have the reaction almost like at the same time, when you'd think it'd have to go from like cell to cell or like arm to leg, like the brain, like it just, the whole body just agrees and acknowledges what's happening. Just like in quantum entanglement, I mean, I guess if you take space away, time becomes less of a question.
Well, so physicists are torn on this, and I am as well, but I find it interesting that many people report an experience of spaceless, timeless awareness. It may or may not mean, it's like another intuition that arises in certain circumstances that may or may not actually be giving us a window onto a deeper reality. But I think it's very interesting that in those states, we do in certain situations get a much more accurate window onto reality. And that's one big question that is kind of throughout my series and that I still think about is whether time will go the way of space, whether that is actually something that's not fundamental either, and whether we are just deeply confused that we, in the same way that we used to think colors were out there in the universe, our intuition so strongly, the way we are made most of the time is that space is clearly out there, right? We can like what can we rely on if we can't rely on space? But it may be that the thing we experience is a mapping of something else, and that something else is actually very different from space and time.
Right.
And if consciousness, this actually gets to one of your earlier questions, if consciousness is fundamental, there are ways in which those truths that we're starting to be, bump up against in physics actually are easier to understand if consciousness is the fundamental thing. So there are many things that come out of the math and the physics that are incredibly interesting, that are very hard for our human minds to get around, and that's not a reason to think, they're impossible to get our minds around. I'll give a few examples. One is, there's some very well-known and well-respected mathematicians who believe that any object that comes out of the math, any geometry that comes out of the math, if the math dictates it, it's not just a hypothetical. Those objects must exist. And of course, their intuitions may or may not be right, but many very talented mathematicians believe that kind of the math is describing our reality better than we could ever have access to. And so there's something called a deGrasse. It's a 10-dimensional object. I don't even know how to imagine a 4-dimensional object, let alone a 10-dimensional object, but it comes out of the math, right? The math tells us that it's possible for this 10-dimensional object to exist in nature. If consciousness is fundamental, if what is actually underlying all of the stuff that we perceive as matter, if what it actually is, if the intrinsic nature of all of the matter that we perceive is felt experience, a 10-dimensional experience, even if we could never imagine it or know what that is, at least is a plausible idea.
How is that plausible?
So it's actually one of the physicists kind of sent me down this path that I spoke to, Jana Levin. She studies black holes. She's a brilliant woman and actually a beautiful writer. I recommend all her books. We were having this recorded conversation for my documentary series, and we were actually talking about different dimensions. We were just talking about the physics of things and string theory, and I was just trying to understand, what does 4, 5, 6, 7 dimensions of space actually mean? And is there some way for someone like me to understand this better? And I was getting stuck on something that I still find fascinating, which is that we as human beings can really only imagine anything in 3 dimensions. So we realize it's hard to imagine bigger. We think we can imagine 2 dimensions like a plane and 1 dimension a point. But the truth is we're not actually imagining a 2-dimensional plane when we imagine it, because true 2 dimensions has no depth.
That's it.
And it disappears. As far as we're concerned, it doesn't exist, right? You take a piece of paper and you slice it in half and slice it and slice it. And then if it's truly 2-dimensional, we cannot imagine that, because for us, that's nothing. And so we're stuck in these 3 dimensions. And I was kind of talking through all of this and having this interesting conversation with her. And she said, I love this. She said this. She said, well, I don't know. What about love? Like, is that 3 dimensions? And I love that a physicist pointed this out to me of all my years of meditation.
Me too.
Yeah. And I started thinking, okay, we experience a lot of things that aren't necessarily spatial. I mean, just, our range of emotions, hunger even. Where is hunger? Like of course, there's like a stomach feeling, but a lot of the things we experience are pretty amorphous and we wouldn't necessarily put into spatial dimensions. And then when you talk about experiences people have under psychedelics, I mean, those experiences seem to me like something that I would imagine are impossible if I hadn't had them myself. They're so unlike the human experience.
They're quite ineffable too. I mean, that part of that, and which kind of leads to it being a different dimension, because we can't imagine it. So there's no language for it.
Exactly. And, another thing that's interesting to me about consciousness that I kind of was able to fine tune my thinking a little bit about through the creation of this documentary series is the fact that we need to share experiences in order to communicate anything. Because You see pink in your world, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing pink right now. I can never share that direct experience with you. I can talk to you about it because you have a reference point.
Sure.
But to explain what it's like to see pink to someone who was born
Sure.
blind, impossible.
There's an idea that no two people see the world exactly the same anyway.
Well, and I'm sure that's the case, but at least we have the reference point, right? If you take away vision,
Sure.
you take away hearing, you take
Sure.
away touch.
Yeah.
A bat is experiencing sonar. There's no way a bat and I are ever gonna discuss, even if we could come up with the language, if you don't actually share an experience, you
Sure.
can't talk about it. And I think that's partly why these experiences under psychedelics and meditation are so difficult to talk about, because there haven't been enough people enough of the time to develop language around it. We truly do need new language for it.
I also wonder if science follows the sort of that kind of theme, in a sense that, trying to really understand quantum mechanics and make all the math that's ever been discovered make sense, but it doesn't, right? There's like a whole new, and I've wondered if when we shift dimensionally, if it requires essentially new rules.
Right. Well, and that's what a lot of the new theories of quantum gravity are essentially creating new physics to explain.
Yeah.
But what I think is fascinating is all of those theories that are in the works right now. If you look at them through the lens of consciousness being fundamental, they make a little bit more sense. In the same way that a deGrasse, if we try to imagine it in the way we understand matter and space and time, a 10-dimensional thing, our minds just explode. Like there's no way to make sense of that. But a 10-dimensional feeling, and maybe that's, some future AI or whatever. But if something could be created in the universe that is many, many times more complex than the human brain, and there's a consciousness associated with that, you can imagine an experience just getting more and more complex and having more dimensions to it, whatever that means at the level of experience. They don't have to be spatial in the way that we experience space.
We mentioned AI, so I mean, one of the words comes up is like sentient, but since we're talking about consciousness, it's like, if consciousness is fundamental, if it's fundamental, does that mean it's in everything? Meaning it's in this glass, it's in the rocks, it's in the trees, it's in the bushes, which it's definitely in the trees and bushes because they've spoken to me on drugs before. They're sure, definitely in the trees and bushes. But if it's in everything, is that what we mean when we say fundamental?
Yes.
Okay.
It is what I mean. It's not what everyone means, but it's what I mean. Yes.
Somewhat makes sense, because
and actually I would phrase it differently. I wouldn't say it's in all of those things. I would say that's the intrinsic nature of all those things. We perceive them the way we perceive them because of the kind of relational way the universe is structured. That is how those conscious experiences that are arising in that point in space and time, whatever that is, it's a bowl, it's a table, is affecting the conscious experiences that are arising here in my system, in my brain.
Okay.
I mean, I perceive that as matter, right?
Yeah.
But what it is at bottom, and why it's so hard for us to fit the quantum into our understanding of physical reality, is because what it actually is felt experience. It's what everything is made of. And the physical is the way it gets perceived, where how the connections are being perceived.
Yeah, it almost seems like consciousness itself as a word has a slightly new definition, or
I think
way
that's
of
right.
looking at it, as opposed to consciousness in my mind would have been, consciousness is sort of like it's a feeling, it's an energy, it's a thought. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I should actually make that clear.
Yeah,
I'd love
to,
better
because
about
that
definitions.
Totally puts it in a new light. Go ahead.
It is. And what I'm talking about, I think it's actually the most basic definition of consciousness, what I'm talking about. But in our culture and in neuroscience, and what most people think of when they use the word conscious is complex thoughts, self-awareness, all the things that human beings do, we associate with consciousness. But when I use the word, in this sense, where I talk about something that could be fundamental and that is mysterious and that all my work is about, it's really just the fact that there's a felt experience at all. So, if a snail is conscious. We wouldn't expect it to have thoughts or to, do anything, that complicated, for anything complicated to arise in its conscious awareness. Maybe there's a sense of pressure. Maybe there's a sense of temperature, kind of just the most basic types of content. And so, yes, when I say something like consciousness is kind of what the table essentially is at bottom, I'm not imagining there's any thoughts or feelings or those types of things in the table. And what I imagine, I'm trying to construct a view at this point. My best guess is that they are these very minimal experiences that come in and out of being almost instantaneously. There's no memory. Human beings, complex form of memory, and so there's this continuity from past to future. But consciousness experiences can come and go. They can arise and disappear. And just because it's a felt experience doesn't mean there's memory associated with it, doesn't mean there's complexity associated with it. It could be the most minimal thing we could picture, maybe a slight touch of a pin on a hand or whatever the most minimal felt experience there is. And then the question that comes up for me always is, if consciousness is fundamental, is it possible that consciousness itself actually is kind of contentless, that you don't need a feeling of pressure, a sound, a sight, any particular shape to it? Is there something, that is essentially pure consciousness, pure awareness without any content? And that's something that comes up in people's experiences on psychedelics and meditation as well. And so that's one of the big questions where I land and that I'm still thinking about.
I would be thinking that it's full of information but the information,
maybe the information is the structure.
Like if I'm imagining that we're waves again, right? There's not information in that. The information comes with,
it comes with structure. Yes. Yes. I think of it as structure.
Like I'm thinking about, like a sort of like a age old, like your car won't start. I mean, luckily, I don't think we have this problem, but your car won't start. And you're like, come on, baby. Like essentially there's an ability to communicate and energetically connect with this metal thing, right? And that maybe there's a belief that we can connect with it, or like getting something to work right. It's like, is there a way that we actually, as feeling, thinking human beings, can connect with more of an inanimate object, but we're connecting with it based on its frequency? We're like, or even maybe let's go a level up. Let's talk about plants. You speak to your plants well. I mean, there's been like the rice experiment, plant experiments, where you speak positive into one and negative into the other, and one grows and one dies. I mean,
those have been debunked, but there are even more fascinating studies done on plants. So it's okay that those have been debunked.
Well, I've got a giant snake plant. It's literally, before you hopped on, I was showing Jen like how big my snake plant is. Yeah. I'm like, I don't know. Plants just grow in this house. And she's like, why? And I said, good vibes, I guess. Like I have like a whole set of like,
oh no, I have a whole chapter devoted to plants, because we have learned a lot about plants in the last 10 to 20 years. I mean, some of the research is absolutely fascinating.
There's a video the other day about like a plant moving towards you. You're like, hey, come here, come say hi, and the plant like moves over and touches you. Okay, so what'd you learn?
I don't know about that, and there's definitely a lot of pseudoscience out there but it doesn't matter, because the actual science is so fascinating, and that we don't need
pseudoscience anymore. So what is it?
I mean, I can give so many examples, but I have chapter 4 is completely devoted to plant behavior, and kind of gives a overview of like the latest research. I'll just my favorite example is a plant called Bokila. And it's a plant that camouflages itself. And this Bokila we didn't know about until 2014. So this is some of the newest plant research.
We're such a baby. We're humans. We're such a baby. Jeez.
And that's something I like to say a lot too. We are at the infancy of our species. I mean, we are just barely getting started.
So in 2014,
so much we don't understand. Yeah, exactly. And there are so many more we don't yet understand. But this alone is just, I mean, mind-blowing. So Bokila, we started truly studying and understanding better in 2014. because it camouflages so well and it's so pervasive in certain jungles that nobody really paid attention to it. So it's very boring when it's not camouflaging itself. It's a very boring plant. I think it has 3 leaves. It's not that interesting. Botanists were never interested in it. And it's kind of this vine that grows everywhere. And then it just kind of like disappears into the brush. And what they realized was it's never actually disappearing. It is camouflaging itself. And so the Bokila is in all these interesting places where it can change its glossiness. It can grow its leaf, I think, to something like 15 times its normal size. In one case that they found, I forget which plant it was mimicking, but this plant has a thorn underneath the leaf that like you'd have to turn over to see it. It mimics that thorn. The glossiness, the vein pattern of the leaves. It can mimic so many details of so many different plants. And the question is,
like the octopus,
how is it doing? Exactly. It is. Yes. And actually the scientist who talks about this horn, not horn, the thorn that it grows is the equivalent of a human being growing a rhinoceros horn. There was one scientist, I forget which jungle he was working in, but he decided to follow the Bokila that, was in the area, and he realized it was mimicking the other plants in the forest. And so now there's all this research being done on them. The question is, how does the plant get the information about, how does it do it is another category. But the first category of questions is, how does it know the color, the vein pattern, the size, the thorns? And so the question, the answer to that question is either some sort of vision. And we know that plants have more photoreceptors on their bodies than we have in our eyes. And so plants are constructed very differently from human beings, and there's no brain and there's no central nervous system. And so,
is it not connected with the mycelium network, or is that just mushrooms?
They are, but there's central. Yes, no. And that's all fascinating too. And all of that work I find fascinating because the reason I got interested in plant research was because I started becoming interested in how far down consciousness might go in life.
Right.
And what you see in the plant kingdom is actually, in many cases, remarkably similar behavior to human behavior once you understand what they're doing. And so, yes, in mycelium networks, there's fascinating work done. I talk about all of this in the chapter on plants, where different species of trees communicate, where they send each other carbon. There's been studies done in Canada by a woman named Suzanne Simard. She has a wonderful TED Talk, actually, if you're interested. She did this research wondering if trees could recognize the seedlings, the plants that grew from their own seedlings. And it turns out they can. So she calls these mother trees. And there's this beautiful work about these mother trees who can distinguish their kin in the forest from other trees that did not grow from their own seedlings. And they make more room for their roots. They deliver more carbon to the trees that grow from their seedlings. They deliver more messages. We now know that plants share messages of when there are parasites or infestations of some kind. They send chemical signals to warn other plants. These mother trees send more signals to their kin than to the other trees in the forest. And so this, it's very different from human behavior, but it certainly starts to fall into these same categories of things that we think we need consciousness for. We think, a mother couldn't protect her children, couldn't experience love, all of these things that we think we need conscious experiences for to execute this behavior. You start to question whether that's a legitimate intuition when you see these other living systems that protect their young and do similar things. And we can imagine very easily they do that without any conscious experience. And so how many places in nature?
Is there a spectrum then potentially of consciousness? Like, is it binary, like you have it or you don't? Or do you think it's kind of like light or sound or so many things that there's just a wide spectrum? And
I've
that
thought
maybe
a lot
some
about
of the
this.
things that we think are like consciousness in more of a spiritual, intuitive sense is actually a new word. Consciousness is now more base, and that there's actually maybe a new way of looking at that kind of information, that it's maybe something different, or maybe
no,
it's
it's a
all
great
purely
question.
connected and it's a spectrum.
So I feel pretty strongly about my answer here because of the way I'm defining consciousness, and the phenomenon that I'm actually interested in is, whether there's an experience being had from the inside. And actually, I'll put it in slightly different terms. At least within the sciences, our belief has been that, the universe is made of non-conscious matter. And
Mm-hmm.
then when it gets put together in a certain way, suddenly or not so suddenly, there's an experience of being that matter from the inside. And that's kind of a new property in a sense that arises. I don't look at it that way now. I don't think any new properties have to arise. But the idea that there would be a felt experience at all, to me, that's a binary property. It's either there or it isn't. I don't see how you can say you have a little bit of it, because then you're on the spectrum. But what I think is a spectrum is the content, is the range of experiences that are had. And so I think, you can go from it's always some kind of pressure, feeling of temperature, or something like that I think is the most basic thing I can imagine. If you had a creature that only experienced, pressure, stronger pressure, lighter pressure, that's all they had a gauge for. Um, that would be on one end of the spectrum. And then, human beings or beyond, there's many more complex experiences in the universe that we don't have access to. But I think the content, the range, the type, the quality of the experience is clearly on a spectrum. But I think it's kind of nonsensical at this point to talk about consciousness itself being on a spectrum, because there either is a felt experience or there isn't. I don't see how you can get around that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of the way I became convinced that consciousness is fundamental, because if there isn't a spectrum, it's very hard to see where consciousness could arise in nature. It seems that it has to go all the way down. That there's no place at which it makes sense to say, oh yeah, when the atoms do this, then suddenly the atoms have an experience from the inside. There's no place where that argument holds.
So that would mean that AI or a robot, let's say, the robot
Yeah,
gets programmed, the robot has consciousness.
right.
And the way
So
you're
this is
using words.
something that I've thought a little bit about, not as much as I probably should have, or that people think I have. And actually, part of the reason is because I'm interested in whether consciousness is fundamental. I'm as interested in, what type of conscious experiences are generated at the level of the table as I
Right.
am in, rabbits or mice, or I mean, it's all fascinating to me. And so AI isn't necessarily that much more interesting to me than any other system. But one thing that I think a lot about and that I have some concerns about is if consciousness is fundamental, and somehow the configuration of matter is correlated with what types of experiences are there in that system. Um, AI, however much like human beings, it seems to be on the outside, is put together and made of very, very different matter and material and organized very differently. Even the intelligence is a different kind of intelligence.
Hmm.
And so if consciousness is fundamental, these systems are already conscious and will be
Yeah.
conscious. But the strange thing is they may feel, more different from us than a bat does. I mean, a bat is more similar as a system. A bat has a brain with neurons, and it's much more similar to us than any form of AI. And so the question is, well, there are many questions, but the problem is we will be encountering artificial systems that behave the way we do. So our intuitions tell us they feel the way we do.
Trickery.
Yes.
Back to trickery
But
again.
we won't have any idea what their experience is like, because if it's based on the configuration of the matter, it is not going to be anything like a human being. And so it will be a new circumstance that we, to the best of our knowledge, has never been encountered in nature, where a system externally
Hmm.
seems identical or close to identical, but is
Right.
actually internally a completely different thing.
What do you think what scares you about that the most?
I think, I tend to not think too much about this, and maybe because it is so creepy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have, manipulation of human beings, I
Sure.
think. Yeah. David Eagleman, the neuroscientist I mentioned, this is so fascinating, and in one of his teams at Stanford, created an unbeatable rock, paper, scissors, because by this mechanism that I explained before, they insert a delay very slowly as you're playing the computer. They start to insert a delay. At first, it's instantaneous. You and the computer are both showing your hand at the same time. They slowly insert a delay, and then they remove it. And so what happens is you feel like you and the computer are answering at the same time, but the computer has a 200 millisecond advantage, and it knows before it already knows what your hand is. And I mean, that's such a simple example, but if AI could, start manipulating us through these means, consciousness or not, it's all.
I mean, we're already being manipulated, and we're already being manipulated through devices and information and all kinds of things. So, with the information collected, to be able to shift your views, beliefs, give you more of it, give you something new. I mean, it's already kind of happening.
Yes.
I'm wondering if the telepathy tapes coming out played into any of your research, or like, if I don't, because there's some crazy stuff, and we're talking about different levels of consciousness, perhaps, or just the information. But like animals, I mean, I remember listening to one of those, and it was like the animals know just before you come home, like they go wait by the door. And I'm about to set up a camera to test that theory out, because one of my dogs.
That's telepathy, though. I think we understand that. I mean, they have I'm forgetting the technological term, but their their noses, they smell, I mean, a much wider range.
No, but it's like 20 minutes early they go to the door.
Right. Yes.
They can't smell you coming. They can't hear.
Well, I actually don't know. I don't know how far the range is. Olfactory, is that what they are? Olfactory receptors? But whatever that is, I think there's good reason to believe we don't need to rely on telepathy, that they're even if we don't fully understand it yet, there are all kinds of ways we could explain. I mean, it's not that, there's motion, there's there are things that can be detected in the environment that you wouldn't need telepathy for. I'm actually very interested in lots of examples that I've seen, actually, particularly in what are they called? A child who's born with extreme
autism?
Talent. No, so like a 3-year-old,
like
who can play, Mozart and
like a prodigies.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There are lots of things that we don't know how to explain, that it would be hard to see how our current understanding of science could explain. So I just like to say that at the outset, that I'm actually very interested in all of that. And I'm interested, I think most cases that are brought forward in the public of telepathy are not great examples of it. And so I don't even like to use the word telepathy, but other ways of, and actually the last chapter of my documentary series talks about kind of the future of science and how we might be able to experience things that have never been experienced before, communicate with other systems like plants. I think all of that is like a possible future of science. Having said all of that, I haven't listened to the telepathy tapes. I've listened to parts. I saw a lot of red flags from what I was hearing, and I actually have a couple of scientist friends right now who are in the process of debunking.
That's the
so
nature
my
of
guess
science.
is it's not. My guess is it's not the kind of telepathy you and I hope it is.
Yeah,
but I don't think that means it doesn't exist. I just think this is probably not a good example of it. I think there, like a lot of the things I talked about the brain, things that we understand about the brain. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the things they report on can be explained by things we already understand about the brain.
We think about like science or scientific, but it's almost like a vetting process. Like science is just basically like a giant vetting process where, other than being an actor getting rejected, maybe scientists are the most rejected people in the world, because you are subject to all the criticism from everybody. Yeah. That's essentially the process.
Exactly. And actually, the scientists who are scientists at heart, who are doing the work in the most genuine way, are happy to be proven wrong. That's kind of the game. Is
you're just trying to figure it out.
Yes, it's just, there's just this genuine desire to understand the truth. And so if they're wrong, they want to know they're wrong.
Yeah.
And I love that about it. And I also think, the scientists who I most appreciate and I think are the most respected are very humble. They will be the first to admit what they don't know and what they don't understand.
Mm.
And the truth is, there is no science without not understanding things, because that's what it's all about. So you kind of you have to admit that there's all this you don't understand, and that we're kind of trying to do our best to
there has to
it.
be a reason why we're asking these questions. You know, where are those questions coming from? Why are we asking them? Why? I mean, there's definitely a part of me that feels like we'll never get the answer in a way.
Yeah, we might not.
But yet we're here. So like, and there's a giant curiosity around this. Yeah. And unless you start asking questions, you know, I think it was like Neil deGrasse Tyson said it to me. It's like at every question, you kind of make the bubble bigger and increase the amount of questions. That's essentially right. Like it just becomes this larger and larger complex situation, and more questions arise. Yeah. But it leads me to wonder, what is the question you want answered and why?
That's a great question. You know, the best I can hope for at this point is that I would like to know if what I have convinced myself of so far, based on my research and conversations, is actually more likely true. If the assumption that consciousness is fundamental is more likely true than the assumption that it emerges out of complexity. And I think, at least in my lifetime, that's probably the best we'll be able to do. But I've gotten myself to, 70, 75%. I think if other more, talented scientists, and I think there's, the last chapter of my series is called The Future of Science. I'm very excited to see where all of this leads. But I think, in the same way that both the science and our intuitions have helped us understand that other mammals are conscious. Hundreds of years ago, I think there was some confusion about whether dogs and cats are conscious. I think we understand the brain well enough now. And also we see enough similarities to know that when, our pet looks like they're in pain, we understand pain, and there's something similar going on. My hope is that actually with some future scientific methods, we might be able to gain intuitions for at least other living systems like plant systems, where we will have intuitions that are as strong as the ones we have for our pets for other systems in nature. And so I think there might be this gets into really weird sci-fi stuff, but the future is always weird sci-fi stuff. You go back 100 years, no one would believe all the, that we're having this conversation.
Driverless cars and,
we're having this telepathic conversation over Zoom. Yeah.
Right.
That there might be ways to connect to other systems. David Eagleman is a neuroscientist who talks about this work a little bit, so that we might actually be able to gain intuitions for systems that we're very different from. And that might lead to intuitions that are just as strong as the intuitions we have now for essentially guesses. I mean, the truth is, I can't even know for sure that you're conscious. I can't have your experience. I can't be you. There's no way for me to have access to your conscious experiences, but I have enough to go on to think that it's a pretty fair assumption. And then same with our cats and dogs and so forth. And so my hope is that through some future scientific methods, we will be able to confirm or disconfirm through intuitions that we can develop about other systems, whether there's consciousness present in them.
I hope so too. But how does that help us? What does that do? Like, what's the point?
There's the big question, what's the point? And there may not be a real answer to that. But I think
why are we here? The why are we here thing?
But at the human level, I think one of our most redeeming qualities as a species is our curiosity, and our ability to understand things better. The fact that we haven't been here that long and we've gained deeper and deeper understanding. I think it's just fun. There's Agreed. That. The other thing is, what seems to happen with science is when we understand the world better, we're actually able to create better tools. And sure. Just like we mentioned, this Zoom call, it's not something anyone ever intended from the original scientific discoveries, but we seem to be able to develop new technologies the better we understand. My hope, and this is just my optimism also, is that the more we understand, the closer we are to truth, the better we can be as a species.
My dad's been asking me for decades. He's probably stopped asking by now, but he's like, why are you asking questions you're never going to get the answer to? And it's like, I've basically come to the conclusion that it's like, if I know how this works, I can play the game better.
Yeah, right.
That's it.
And we do. I mean, we see it, we develop antibiotics, and then we end up having issues with antibiotics, and but we keep having better understanding and developing tool. I mean, we go to
or
outer
I can
space.
create my reality that I want.
Amazing.
Yeah. Go to another planet. What happens if an asteroid's coming at us? Then we know how to get off planet.
Yeah.
Or I just know how to create a more joyful, happy life. I think, personally, I believe that duality and sort of the polarities that we experience with happy and sad and all the experiences is inherent. I think it's baked into this reality that we live in. I think it's part of being human. But the idea of learning how to live with more joy and peace and, creating more of the reality that I want and being more in charge of my life or something like that. If I know how to do that, then I'm playing the game better.
Yes.
I'm winning.
I think that's true
I'm at
on
level
a whole.
whatever now.
Yeah. I mean, I think humanity as a whole is able to evolve in that way. I mean, that is my hope and my belief that we can become better as a group.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you for all of your deep diving and your curiosity and living in the mystery and helping us understand what's really going on.
Yeah. Thank you for excellent questions and a great conversation.
Thanks everybody for listening to the Pretty Intense podcast today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you heard today and you want to hear more, please click on the subscribe button.